Hi, welcome to MK Chess Academy channel. Today we are going to explain the piece movements. Now let's start with pawn first. So in chessboard always white needs to start first and then proceeded with the black. So if we see, right, we have pawns on A2, B2, C2, D2, E2, F2, G2 and then H2. I would like to move the pawn on E2. So this pawn I can move to E3 or E4 when the pawn is in its initial square, means when the pawn is in a square where it is not at all moved. We normally call that square as initial square. If the pawn is in initial square, it can move two steps at a time. But once the pawn moved out of its initial square to any other square, it can go only one step at a time. So now the pawn on e2, it can go to e3 or it can go to e4. I want to move this pawn to e4. Now in case if opponent wants to block this pawn, he can move his e7 pawn to e5. So the pawn will always go straight only, unless until it has a piece in its attacking square. In case if there are no pieces in the attacking square and it has its own colored piece, or it has the opponent piece just behind its square, like here e4 behind square is e5, then this pawn will be blocked, means this pawn cannot move anywhere, it has to stay there only. So for e4 pawn, the attacking square will be the adjacent squares, which will be d5 and f5. And similarly, if we take another example for c2 pawn, the attacking square is b2, b3 and d3. For a2 pawn, the attacking square is b3, and for h2 pawn, the attacking square is g3. So similarly, if we take h7 pawn, the attacking square is g6. Now, unless until the opponent moves any piece to d5 or f5, the pawn on e4 is blocked. Now, since the black moved its pawn to e5, now it is the white turn to move its pawn. Now, I want to move another pawn, like the pawn on d2, the pawn on d2 to d3. Okay, now it is white turn. The white wants to move the pawn to the d5. So now this pawn can move to, and it can go ahead and capture this piece since it has a piece, opponent's piece in the attacking square. So this is called as capturing the piece. Okay, once we capture the piece, the opponent can move any pieces. Right now, I want to explain a special rule called En Passant. So what is meant by En Passant is, as per the chess rule, the pawn has to communicate or it has to meet the other opponent's pawn. Now the pawn on d7 is attacked by the pawn on e4, where the d7 moved to d5 and the e4 pawn attacked e5. So here let's take a scenario. The opponent moved some other pawn. Now I moved this h pawn to h4. Now the opponent moved some other pawn. Now I moved this h4 pawn to h5. Okay. Now my whenever the white pawn is on fifth rank, and if the black moved this pawn from seventh rank to fifth rank, means this pawn attacking square is only h6. So whenever any pawn jumps out of his attacking square and move to another square, so now this pawn cannot attack this pawn, means this pawn doesn't communicate with this pawn. So as per chess rule, each and every pawn has to communicate with each other pawns when it is moving to the other direction. So in this scenario, we can consider it as an enpassment, and the white can feel the pawn on g6. Even though it is moved to g5, it can go ahead and capture the pawn on g5. And similarly the same rules applies for black also, in case if the black moved its pawn. Like let's take a scenario like the pawn on b7. I'm just going to the moving this pawn to g7, and let's assume I move some other pawn. Now the black pawn moved to b4. Now whenever the black pawn is on fourth rank, and if white moved either a or c, so since this pawn is attacking square is a3 and c3, in case if we move this pawn two squares at of time, like since initial when it is initial square we can move the pawn to two squares. In case if I move the a2 pawn to either a4, or if I move the c2 pawn to c4, which means this pawn is jumping out of its attacking square, and this pawn will never interact with this pawn. So in this scenario, so this the pawn on b4 can go ahead and capture this c4 pawn, assuming in the mind that the pawn is on c3. So this rule is called as en passant. So again, I am repeating it. So if we had to do the en passant, the white pawn has to be on fifth rank, and the adjacent pawn of the black has to jump from seventh rank to fifth rank. And when it comes to the black, if the black pawn is on fourth rank, and when white pawn jumps from second to fourth rank, the adjacent pawn, then we can apply the en passant rule. Yeah, thanks for watching the video. In the next video, we will try to explain about the other pieces. Thank you.